Hello everyone, welcome to this interview with Doing Sociology. Today we are very honored to have Professor John Harris with us. Briefly introducing him, he is a Professor Emeritus at the Simon Fraser University. He has more than 30 years of teaching and institution building experience. He has been a visiting faculty at the LSE, SOAS, Center for Modern Indian Studies at the University of Göttingen, and our very own JNU. His areas of interest include political economy of development, Indian politics, political participation in civil society, agrarian change, and institutional theories. Some of his works include India Today, Economy, Politics and Society with Stuart, Corbridge and Jeffery, that was published by the OUP in 2013, and Understanding India's New Political Economy, A Great Transformation, edited with Sanjay, Ruparelia, Sanjay, Reddy, and Stuart Corbridge, published by Routledge in 2011. We welcome you, sir, to this conversation, and we thank you for taking time out for this across time zones. Welcome to this conversation.
Thank you.
So, to begin with, I'm just going to throw a Karl Polanyi quote at you. In his work, The Great Transformation, he wrote something along the lines of, and I quote, "A country approaching the fascist phase showed symptoms among which the existence of a fascist movement proper was not necessarily one. At least as important signs were the spread of irrationalistic philosophies, racialist aesthetics, anti-capitalist demagogy, heterodox currency views, criticism of the party system, widespread disparagement of the regime, or whatever was the name given to the existing democratic setup." Now, this is from The Great Transformation, in which Polanyi studied the world crisis in the mid-20th century, along with the rise of fascism. So, can you compare what was happening in the world then to the current crisis that is, taking place? And can we also use Polanyi's works or analysis to make sense of what is happening to the world presently? Because we do see a rise of the populist and, authoritarian regimes across the world.
Okay, that's a good question with which to start. Perhaps just sort of remind us that Polanyi's Great Transformation was published first in 1944, and it's one of those works that never goes away, and it's extraordinarily interesting, actually, how there has been such a resurgence of interest in Polanyi's writing, in Polanyi's work, especially in the Great Transformation over the last decade or so. I mean, I recall I was actually teaching the Great Transformation at the time of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And just how very apposite it seemed. And actually pretty much from that time that there's been such a sort of resurgence of interest in Polanyi's work in the Great Transformation. Yeah, and I've often been struck by the passage that you quoted about the country approaching the fascist phase, because it has such resonances with what's happening or what has been happening in our world today. Spread of irrationalistic philosophies. Well, think today of the QAnon, conspiracy theories, which so many people in the United States seem to be taken up with. Racialist aesthetics today. The sort of aesthetics around white supremacism, for example, anti-capitalistic demagogy. Remarkably, Trump perpetrated quite a bit of anti-capitalistic demagogy. Criticism of the party system. That's implicit in the events in the United States with the storming of the Capitol at the beginning of this year. widespread disparagement of the regime. You know, think of Modi's disparagement of the Congress regime and of the old Congress elite. So, you know, it just, that particular passage, it struck me, had so much resonance with the present. But the important question you raise is, you know, how relevant is Polanyi's analysis of the mid-20th century crisis to today? And I think to answer the question, you know, if I may, just needs us to remind ourselves of what Polanyi's argument was. The book, The Great Transformation, begins with these two sentences: 19th century civilization has collapsed. This book is concerned with the political and economic origins of this event, as well as with the rise, as well as with the great transformation which it ushered in. The great transformation is what he's talking about are the changes brought about with what he refers to as the collapse of 19th century civilization. And you know, what he's talking about is effectively the collapse of the attempt that was initiated really in Britain in the 1830s to establish a self-regulating market economy. The self-regulating market economy, which is in a sense the ideal of economic liberals. Okay, it's the argument that markets left alone, will establish an equilibrium which makes for efficiency, fairness, and the best possible results for everyone. But what Polanyi points out is establishing or trying to establish a self-regulating market economy means that three crucial factors of production, labor, land, and capital, have to be, labor, land, and money, sorry, have to be treated as commodities. They too must, be traded, if you will, in the market. But Polanyi's point is that labor, land, and money are not their inherent nature commodities. What is labor but basically human activity? What is land? Well, it's a kind of a shorthand for the natural environment which is given to us, not created by us. And what is money? It's a medium of exchange, a store, perhaps a store of value. Labor, land, and money can only ever be, Polanyi argues, fictitious commodities. But the attempt to commodify them, he argues, brought about what he calls the double movement. I think of as the double movement of modern history, which is, on the one hand, the attempt to, if you will, to establish this self-regulating market economy. And that gives rise to a pushback on the part of labor, on the part of those whose livelihoods, interests are bound up with land, and ultimately a pushback actually on the part of states against money in its commodity form, which means money which is based on the gold standard, that according to which those banknotes that specify so many pounds, rupees, whatever it is, should be converted or convertible into a particular amount of gold, a currency backed by gold. So it's a commodity form of money. And the commodity form, that commodity form of money, Yeah, one can see the rationale for that. But, gold is, inherently in limited supply. And, if under the gold standard, if a country then imports more than it exports, it maybe has to export some of its gold to pay for those imports. Less gold in, if you will, to back the money in circulation tends to bring deflation, which is of course damaging for business, damaging for employment. And so, governments increasingly through the 19th century, with the operation of the gold standard, intervened using token or fiat money, money that's basically sort of printed, even if it can't be backed up with gold. And what the counter movement to the attempt to establish the self-regulating market brought about in the end was, the collapse of those, if you will, of the global economy, with the great crisis of the late 1920s, the 1930s. The effort to make a reality of this, for what for Polanyi is the utopian idea of the self-regulating market, gave rise to resistance to the commodification of labor through the development of trades unions and pressures for protective regulation to protect labor, in a sense, decommodifying it in practice. There was opposition to the sort of commodification of land and agriculture on the part of peasants and farmers, landowners, who sought to protect, domestic agriculture. So the later 19th century sees moves for the decommodification of labor, the rise of protectionism, and actually the rise of nationalism, which led to the wars of the first part of the 20th century. And it was with the collapse of that project that the Great Transformation came about. What the Great Transformation involved was, the rise of fascism, the rise of communism, but also in the United States, the establishment by Roosevelt of the New Deal. And though Polanyi doesn't really talk about it, it was also saw the rise of social democracy in Scandinavia. These are all different ways, if you will, of, in Polanyi's terms, of re-embedding the economy in society. And just at the time that the Great Transformation was published in 1944, was also, as you know, taking place the conference at Bretton Woods in New England, and there was the establishment of the Bretton Woods agreement, which really set the rules for the operation of the global economy of the West, certainly the economy of the Western world in the post-war period. The Bretton Woods settlement established what one scholar refers to as embedded liberalism, Okay, this was to be a market economy, but a market economy that was subject to a lot of controls and regulation so that states could deliver better welfare for their people. The architects of the Bretton Woods Agreement were principally, of course, Maynard Keynes from Britain and a man called Harry Dexter White from the United States. They said we can't have a situation in which a bunch of bankers, a small number of bankers, can actually dictate to national governments what their policies should be. So, you know, they were opposed to the free movement of capital. That was one of the very important regulations established at Bretton Woods. And under the Bretton Woods Agreement, there was what's sometimes referred to as the golden age of the post-war period in the West, of high rates of growth, and then the establishment of welfare states. So high growth and substantial redistribution. This was what Polanyi actually thought might be possible in the aftermath of the collapse of the effort to establish the self-regulating market economy. What he spoke of as a new era of freedom, in which freedom would not be just, as he said, the appurtenance of privilege, but would penetrate deeply into society. The vision that he had was actually very, very similar, I think, to what Amartya Sen later writes about in terms of, you know, development being about the expansion of human capabilities, of the capacities of people to lead lives that they have reason to value, which depends upon both positive, the expansion of both positive and negative freedoms. That was what Polanyi thought might be possible in the aftermath of the collapse, if you will, of the 19th century project of establishing the self-regulating market. And indeed, I think in the later 1940s, 1950s, 1960s in the West, this was an era of unprecedented freedom. People like myself, I was born in 1945, come from an extraordinarily privileged generation. I mean, I was able to enjoy health and an education that would have been inconceivable for somebody, you know, born in the sort of social position that I was born into in any earlier period in Britain. I, in a sense, did enjoy extraordinary positive freedoms, the positive freedoms that follow from having good health, following from access to good health care, good education, and so on. But of course, the era, the golden age, that era of the late 1940s through to late 1960s, came to an end in a period that was known at the time as that of stagflation. But especially the 1970s, a period of very high levels of inflation. And inflation, of course, has the effect of, if you will, of penalizing the holders of money, of capital, and advantaging those who owe money. And from the 1970s on, really, the central concern of macroeconomic policy has been to get on top of inflation in order to protect the interests of the dominant economic class, of economic elites. And it's from really the end of the 1970s that we see the establishment of neoliberalism at the heart of economic policy. The establishment of neoliberalism really means, it's a renewed attempt to establish the self-regulating market economy. You know the story. I mean, crudely, the idea was, or has been, and amongst many people continues to be, to roll back the state, to minimize the role of the state, and to leave the development of the economy to the free play of market forces. But it seems to me that the late 20th century attempt to establish the self-regulating market economy, though it hasn't had the same fate as the 19th century project, it has still led to an extraordinary crisis in which social, environmental, and financial problems are interwoven. The late 20th century attempt to establish the self-regulating market hasn't had the same fate as that of the 19th century, significantly, I think, because it hasn't had to contend in the same way with the forces of organized labor. What we have seen in the later part of the 20th century, for a variety of reasons, in part those that are discussed so well by Timothy Mitchell in his great book, Carbon Democracy, which traces the implications of the shift from the coal-based economies of the 19th century to the oil-based economies of the mid and later 20th centuries. What we've seen is the fragmentation of labor, the weakening of organized labor. So labor hasn't actually played quite the same part in challenging the project of establishing the self-regulating market, as was the case in the 19th century. But still, the project of neoliberalism has, as I say, created a crisis in which social, environmental, and financial problems are interwoven. The social problems which are associated notably with the increasing precarity of employment, the lack of productive employment, the precariousness of employment for so many people in our societies. The environmental problems that we're all increasingly, thank heavens, familiar with, of global heating. The problems around water. I mean, the problems of access to water in India today, and of course India is not alone in this, but the problems of access to water in India are really, really critical, aren't they? They have such a devastating impact on the livelihoods of so many people. Financial problems. Well, what we have seen under neoliberalism is the increasing frequency of financial crises. And one of the responses is very comparable, I think, with the response that Polanyi talks about to in the great transformation of the mid-20th century, the response that he refers to in the quote with which we began, which is, for him, it was the rise of fascism. For us, I think it's the rise of what I refer to as authoritarian populism. Authoritarian populism in which leaders who claim to represent, or perhaps actually beyond represent, actually in a sense to embody the people in opposition to corrupt elites, have risen to power in a good many countries. They've risen to power through election, but then have really set about eroding the institutions of liberal democracy. Hence my suggestion, or my use of the term of authoritarian populism. It's really a story about what I think of as successive waves, in a way, that run through modern history, with attempts to establish the self-regulating market economy, first in the 19th century and then towards the end of the 20th century. And the transformations that have come about in societies as a result of those attempts to establish a self-regulating market economy, as a result of the sorts of resistances to which that attempt has given rise.
So, because we were talking about the 20th century, and you did mention about neoliberalism and how labor has become precarious, one question that immediately comes to my mind is, there were counter movements in the 20th century, and as you mentioned, they've sort of weakened now in the present times. But then, given that situation, what possibilities of counter movements to, say, market fundamentalism in the 21st century do you see? And because we are talking now in 2021, and we've seen 1.5 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was one unprecedented in the recent times. And it has, the worst impact of the pandemic has been on the working class or labor in across the globe. So how do you see COVID-19 affecting the possibilities of counter movement and also affecting market fundamentalism in the contemporary times?
That's a very important question. So sort of let me start with the context of the pandemic, and then sort of perhaps work back a little bit from there. I think it's important to remind ourselves that the great transformation for Polanyi involved different projects, if you will, for re-embedding the economy in society. One of those projects was fascism, which certainly in Nazi Germany was extraordinarily successful for a time in the 1930s. In rebuilding the economy, in providing good, productive employment. So it was putting, in some senses, people, sort of putting people much more at the center. But of course, fascism depended upon, as Polanyi put it, the extirpation of democratic institutions. Another part of the Great Transformation was yeah, I would say the rise of social democracy. Social democracy in Scandinavia, classically, was a response to that crisis that came about as a result of the collapse of the effort to establish a self-regulating market. And as I was saying, as I said at the end of my long spiel about Polanyi and after, the rise of authoritarian populism is part of the transformation of our own times. And what I think I see in the pandemic, or as a result of the pandemic, is a pretty stark opposition between two opposing trends. One trend is reflected in what's referred to by a good many scholars as the democratic backsliding, which is taking place pretty widely. I mean, what we've seen in India very, very sadly in the context of the pandemic is that the present regime has used the crisis, for example, to bury the opposition to CAA at the beginning or early last year, to continue to crack down on freedoms of expression and on opposition. See somewhat similar trends elsewhere in Asia, Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan, a different story, but the same sort of, it's not just in South Asia, it's very, very, very widely. So the pandemic has created conditions in which, in some cases, those trends associated with the rise of authoritarian populism are become yet more firmly entrenched. But on the other hand, the pandemic has shown up the tremendous importance of community, of social solidarity, and has given rise to demands for the articulation of powerful arguments, maybe put it this way, the articulation of powerful arguments in favor of the renewal of the social contract. And I think actually part of that is the renewal of some of the central elements of social democracy. I'm thinking, for example, of the book recently published by Minouche Shafik, the director of the London School of Economics. I think the book even has the title of Renewing the Social Contract, something of that kind. It's the sort of arguments which have been put very articulately by Raghuram Rajan, these are the voices of intellectuals, but they provide support for I think the very widespread recognition of the importance of the role of the state, the centrality of the role of the state, the need not for rolling back the state, but for much more state intervention, state action to tackle the problem of global heating, state action to tackle other environmental problems, state action to stop the erosion of the the livelihoods of working people. So we have, contending thrusts, and I think this is a very crucial moment. And I'm certainly not going to attempt to predict what I think will happen, but I see these opposing and contending forces as emerging, if you will, out of the pandemic. What I was talking about there of the sort of these opposing trends, as I see it, of the one hand of the deeper entrenchment of authoritarian populism, and on the other, pressures for states to play a much more active role, and states to play a much more active role in a way which restores some of the elements of social democracy from which, I was saying I benefited enormously, and coming as I do from that privileged generation that grew up in the West in the 1950s and the 1960s. It is different in India. It seems to me very significantly because of the success of if you will, the Hindutva forces in making that the sort of the central project, the central issue. Yeah, I mean, in the West, we have, for example, I think it's quite interesting, pretty widely, a recognition of the importance of the work that's done by people who've historically been very low paid in supermarkets and shops and so on, but people on whom we've depended, during the days of isolation, semi-isolation, lockdown of the pandemic. Recognition that those people deserve a better deal, if you will. I think I haven't so far anyway picked up much sense from the reading that I do on a daily basis of what's happening in India. I haven't sort of picked up very much sense that there's at least a very widespread concern in society, that migrant workers should have a better deal, that their rights as citizens should be respected in a way that they have not been historically. Is there any sort of, I know that there are my friends who are supportive of the claims of migrant workers for the respect of their rights as citizens, but I don't get a sense that there's much of a sort of popular drive behind that. Am I right in thinking that it's still a cause, if you will, that is restricted to a relatively small number of, supporters of PUCL and so on? Yeah?
Yes, and I think because a lot of discussion or the debates happen over social media, and so, memory over social media is very short-lived. So maybe this was something that was talked about more a year ago, and now there are barely any discussions about it. So I think in public memory, there would be sections, like you very rightly pointed out, there who are still demanding, rights for the migrant workers. But for people in general, they probably have forgotten about it because a year has passed and they've gotten busy with other things around them. So yes, you're not wrong to have that understanding.
Yeah,
There is a quick shift from, I mean, one issue to another.
I'm sorry?
Sorry, like there's a quick shift from one issue to another. So everything gets forgotten, you know, immediately as soon as a new issue comes out. And I think there's also a lot of visibility politics right now going on, aided by the media. So whenever there is an issue which, you know, demands political intervention, there is immediately some kind of showmanship which is done, and that gets all the, you know, media attention. So that is often happening in India, as we can see.
Yeah, yeah. And just to sort of go back to some parts of what Deepali was saying a few moments ago, and at the beginning of this sort of passage of our discussion, you know, it seemed to me that for a long time there has been, and there continues to be, a lot of opposition to to what is the trends that have been brought about by the pursuit of neoliberalism, or in the Indian context, you know, the famous economic reforms that began 30 years ago, opposition on the part of Labour, which has sought increasingly, I think, to take the route of sort of social movement unionism, and, you know, to make demands for the realization of people's social and economic rights, rather than just being confined to struggles over workplace rights. You know, there's been some positive aspects to what has been happening within the labor movement within the country. The many mutinies against capital, you know, over land. You know, think of the struggles of Adivasis in Orissa, elsewhere in the mineral resource rich parts of Eastern India. Struggles of cultivators, of farmers over land in the commodity, you know, the conversion of, if you will, the conversion of land into real estate in so much of the country. There have been, and there continue to be, quite strong local environmental movements. But the problem is that these movements don't come together in a coherent, and it's not just in India that this is the case. I think it's the case very widely. There's a great deal of opposition, but it hasn't yet come together in a coherent sort of movement of opposition. If it is to happen, I think it may well be, I think it is actually most likely to come about over the environment. It's through this, you know, the struggle to save the environment, to counter global heating, that I think it's possible that there is going to be mobilization which sees different groups of people coming together in a way that hasn't happened so far. And it seems, certainly in this part of the world, but I think in South Asia too, more than ever, so pressing to get on top of global heating, to take action to ensure that, you know, there is water for people, and so on, you know, that Indian cities have clean air or cleaner air, and so on and so on. I think it may be that if there is to be a really coherent counter movement, to use the Polanyian language, it's perhaps most likely to come around issues of environment. Yeah.
Right. So, since we were talking about democracies, what would you think about India being a patronage democracy?
Okay, so we're sort of changing tack a little bit, because as you know, I have been writing about patronage democracy in the recent past. Perhaps I could begin by just saying where this interest on my part comes from. It comes from work that I did a decade or more ago on political participation in Delhi, which was part of a wider project in which I worked with Latin Americanist colleagues who did. We all did studies which were absolutely comparable, the same methodology, the same research instruments, the same research design in Delhi, in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, and in Mexico City. And an important part of our understanding of what political participation means was participation of people in what we thought of as public problem solving. And we found that in all three of these cities, there was quite widespread participation by people in attempts to engage in public problem solving, problems over, those day-to-day things, quality of the roads, access to water, access to electricity, those kinds of issues. What my Latin Americanist colleagues found so surprising was that while especially poorer people in Delhi are actually, according to our findings, very active in attempts at public problem solving, people very rarely act alone. They most frequently attempt to tackle public problems through recourse to locally powerful people, the pradhans of Delhi slums, and political parties. And of course, talking about pradhans and political parties, well, we know that there's very often a close relationship between pradhans or locally powerful people and particular political parties. So problem solving, not alone, but through local leaders, locally powerful people, local intermediaries, and political parties, and people acting usually in groups. Only in 7% of cases did people take action as individuals, whereas in Sao Paulo, 48% of the instances of efforts at public problem solving that came up in the course of our surveys, 48% of cases, people acted alone. They went on their own to a government office, picked up the phone and addressed somebody or other in a government office. That happened very rarely in Delhi. And my Latin Americanist colleagues, found it really surprising. Why do people, operate in groups? Why do they go through local intermediaries, political parties? Of course, to me, the Delhi observations, weren't at all surprising, because over the years I've seen how poorer people, and particularly poorer people who are very clearly of lower caste status, how badly they are often treated in government offices. Going in a group, you stand a better chance of being listened to and of not being scorned in some way. And I've been very familiar over many years with the important role of intermediaries, of intermediation between people and politicians, between people and state officials. So that's really where this interest in clientelism, patronage comes from. And you know, the idea of India as a patronage democracy is one that has been discussed for quite a long time, though I think it was sort of classically really defined and discussed by Kanchan Chandra from New York University, getting on for 20 years ago. And what Kanchan was talking about is the important resources of patronage that the state controls in India. You know, even now, it's the case that a majority of the good jobs in the formal sector, or the organized sector, if you prefer that language, are public sector jobs. These are jobs that still are to an important extent in the gift of politicians, or through politicians, the gift of bureaucrats. And there are many other resources that the state disposes of and which constitute a form of patronage, which is used by politicians to build support. And it's so pervasive in the way in which democracy has worked in India that you know, one writer describes India as, you know, the quintessential patronage democracy. Should I go on a little bit, or have I spoken too long already? What would you like? Because I would go on to say that more recently, quite recently, other political scientists who I think are getting into the terrain of political sociology, which is, you know, all this is a debated discussion really in political sociology. More recently, Pratik Chiba and Rahul Verma have argued very emphatically that India is not a patronage democracy, and they're arguing that because they say there is really no evidence of the buying of votes in India, or very limited evidence of the buying of votes, except perhaps at very local levels in panchayat, especially in panchayat elections. Their point being that if we understand clientelism, and in much of the literature, clientelism and patronage are terms that are used pretty well interchangeably, and used to refer to, you know, securing political support through sort of material incentives of some kind. Surely for this to work, those who might offer patronage, you know, need to have quite a lot of information. I mean, notably information about, you know, whether it works, whether those who are provided with some kind of material incentives actually then give back in the form of political support. And, you know, we know from quite a lot of recent research that in many elections, people very happily accept money or other gifts from politicians, but most certainly, don't give support in return. So these are really sort of very, very powerful arguments about patronage democracy, but patronage work. Now there's a lot in this argument, and of course, Chipper and Verma, go on to say that vote buying is a myth doesn't mean to say that money isn't extremely important in elections in India. And we know very well huge amounts of money flow during elections. Candidates maybe need perhaps to be known to be giving away large amounts of money, because it's part of the way in which they establish their credentials as people of significance, people with some sort of power. But the argument is that India can't really be described as a patronage democracy because we can't demonstrate that patronage actually works. My own kind of response to that is to say, yeah, but it still seems to me that Indian democracy is, in a fairly fundamental sense, brokered or mediated by different kinds of intermediaries. In the slums of cities in Rajasthan, studied by Adam Auerbach, for example, the likes of school teachers, people who just have a little bit more education than others, an ability to find their way, around the democracy, to penetrate the red tape, and so on. And I think that there's a lot of evidence from some of the really excellent recent empirical research that shows the importance of intermediaries, of brokers of different kinds in delivering vote banks to aspiring politicians. And there's a kind of interdependence of the politicians and the brokers. Brokers need the sort of access that can be provided by politicians to different parts of government. The politicians, call upon the support of the brokers to deliver vote banks. There are relationships of trust between the brokers and groups of voters. The voters, people, know they can rely for support upon the broker, and they will vote fairly reliably according to what the broker, the intermediary, recommends. Studies of this kind that shows this very well. For example, in Lisa Bjorkman's work in Mumbai, Lord Berenschot's in Gujarat. So, not a patronage democracy, but a mediated or brokered democracy still, very fundamentally so, I think. Since you said you'd asked me about the little book that I wrote some years ago on social capital.
Yes.
Perhaps just say something about that,
yeah.
to end with, because it's, although have been an awful lot of changes in the discourse of development since then. I think the idea of social capital remains a powerful one, and it's still, I think it's referred to a great deal still. I mean, I think I would start by saying that I think of social capital as a sort of middle range sociological concept. You know, it's certainly a concept of value, but it's hardly a kind of grand theory. And yet, you know, it was rather presented as such in the later 1990s and in the early part of the present century, when it was described by some folks in the World Bank as being the missing link in development. For me, I guess I understand social capital rather in the way that it's explained by Pierre Bourdieu. I mean, Bourdieu just says simply, social capital refers to connections, the connections that people have, and which constitute, it talks about these as a form of capital, because connections are a resource which can actually be converted into other forms of capital. Through my connections, I can maybe mobilize finance. You know, I know the right people. The idea of social capital as connections actually starts to suggest that it plays a part in class differentiation. No? Those who enjoy powerful connections are going to be advantaged in relation to those who don't have such powerful connections. But that wasn't the idea of social capital, which became so important late in the 20th century. There, the idea of social capital was one that was expounded particularly by Robert Putnam, political scientist, who did what is in many ways a really remarkable piece of research that was published in a book called Making Democracy Work, Civic Traditions in Modern Italy. There he understands social capital as being equivalent to what he refers to as civic engagement. And he measured civic engagement through the extensiveness of newspaper readership, and these were the particularly important criteria, the extensiveness of newspaper readership and the density of voluntary associations in different parts of Italy. And he demonstrated a very strong sort of correlation between high levels of civic engagement and the quality of governance, more responsive governance, local governments doing more and being more responsive to people in those parts of the country where he could show there was a high level of civic engagement. And particular focus came to be placed upon the importance of associational life, of participation in all different kinds of local associations. Interestingly, Putnam wasn't really talking about associations like political parties or trade unions, but local associations like sports clubs, local orchestras, birdwatching clubs, maybe stamp collectors clubs, and so on. So it was already, in a sense, a rather depoliticized sense of associational life. But how this got picked up in the development discourse was, Here is a very important resource. People coming together on a voluntary basis is a resource which improves the quality of government. And maybe it comes to be people, doing stuff for themselves. Local activism actually taking the place of the state in the supply of local services. And so it fitted extremely well with the still very powerful, neoliberal agenda. And so there was a considerable sort of emphasis on developing local organization, right? In development projects. It was really a return, using a somewhat different language, to what in the 1950s and 1960s was talked about, notably in India, as community development. When people were supposed to come together to, build roads, do stuff in local society. But we know from the many very good studies of the time that what happened with community development projects was that they tended to be taken over by locally powerful people. So that projects were taken up were very often projects that were in the interests of the locally powerful, not actually in collective interest. In other words, what was done in the name of community development was crucially influenced by local power structures and by the class structure of localities. But the language of social capital, understood in terms of civic engagement, and civic engagement meaning lots of local associational life, as I saw it, really obscures the significance of class difference, occludes the significance of local power structures. And it was for that reason that the little book that I wrote was very critical of the uses of the idea of social capital by the World Bank. The book was called Depoliticizing Development, the World Bank and Social Capital. That's not to say that local activism and work on the part of communities within communities isn't extraordinarily important. And going back to that earlier discussion about the present conjuncture, I have a great deal of, if you will, belief in the importance of local activism, but local activism that recognizes the significance of local power structures and of class differentiation, and to deliver benefits for local communities may well call for actually not less but more intervention by the state at the center in localities, if you will, to check the operations of local power holders and of economic elites.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Harris, for taking time out and talking to us today. Indeed, you've touched upon such important issues, and we've talked about some of the classical texts and which have so much relevance even in the present times, and most so now with what is happening globally. And we thank you again for taking time out and doing this interview with us. And we really hope our viewers are going to pick up a lot from this interview. And we do hope that they would go and read your works and then again learn a lot from there. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. It's been nice talking to you guys, and all the very best in everything that you do. I really think that your blog, website, it's a tremendous contribution to the development of sociological scholarship in India, and to the development of active citizens struggling for a better world in the very difficult circumstances of the present that we've been talking about today. So thanks very much, and all the very best. Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you so much.